Hello, in this video I want to start a bit of a new series for the upcoming worker strike resolution for LD, or probably already here by the time that these videos come out. And I think that this is a really interesting set of conversations that will definitely come on the worker strike conversation and the worker strike resolution. And I definitely think will be something that ends up being a core criticism, as it does on like a lot of other resolutions. And that's settler colonialism. I think that settler colonialism will be a really important argument on the worker strike resolution, and I think that is really important to consider the power of like the settler colonialism criticism, because I think that a lot of people could be caught off guard by the ways in which that settler colonialism really problematizes various Marxist understandings of like why centering ideas around laborers and workers is kind of like a value and as a subject is bad. And I think that there are a lot of arguments about why just kind of like the Western notion of this like a centralized universal understanding of a worker is kind of like bad and necessitates a particular relationship to colonialism and the active forgetting and erasure of colonialism in order to produce various forms of violence and extend the capacity of the state to kind of like monopolize space-time, etc. I think that there are a lot of really interesting central arguments that will definitely transition into the workers' strike resolution. And so in this set of series, I definitely want to talk a little bit about like what this strategy looks like on the negative, what it looks like on the affirmative, and obviously what are the best ways to like answer this type of strategy. I think that even for this set of videos, I might do a section on what it does against critical affirmatives, because I actually think that settler colonialism has some pretty interesting angles against various types of critical affirmatives that will show up on this resolution, especially if the Deleuze and Guattari videos that I did are already up. That would be really interesting to see how those things relate to each other. And so I think that in this video, I kind of just want to start out talking about some of the most like central arguments that I think settler colonialism criticisms will use in this type of resolution. I definitely think that at just kind of like a value of just the statement of the resolution, there are a lot of central critiques and problems that settler colonialism take with the way that it kind of like phrases like what kind of resistance looks like and what the state's relationship to that resistance looks like. I think if we just start with just the idea of a worker strike and talk about what some of the normative settler colonial critiques of Marxism are, I think that it's really interesting considering the way in which that it does a couple of things. The first is that there are so many arguments to kind of be made about like how settler colonialism and arguments about primitive accumulation basically require a kind of like an essentialization of like what colonialism looks like and how essential it is to the industrialization process, that kind of like deracializes its analytic from understanding like what it means to be a worker, that the idea of like wage labor is only able to exist because there is a hoarding of resources and a scarcity that is produced under the violence of colonialism and historical genocide that continues on into today. I feel like although obviously the resolution is kind of stated in a way to be like a just government ought to, etc. And I think that obviously means that some of the links that are just based in the argument about like, you know, the US's relationship to Marxism and particularly might not really as much, but I definitely think there are really good examples to cite in terms of like the ways in which deracialized forms of understanding the relationship between like labor and colonialism has basically made it hard to think about like what a worker strike looks like along like the kind of like idea of like things, for instance, like natives being outside of like the normative concept of workers because of the like difference in labor in terms of like labor laws in terms of like reservation lands, etc., and the ways in which those various types of like territorial differences become erased under the kind of like way in which the topic is really thinking about governance in the first place, and why the legitimizing of a worker strike doesn't actually allow for the changing of the ways in which various companies exploit the communities that are outside of, for instance, those that are doing work, right? Like if those that are working can strike, that does not allow, like, for instance, community protests, things like no DAPL, to exist legally because of the ways in which they're outside of the concept of like the workers doing the action of striking, right? All of those things kind of like add to this kind of creation of pathology around the various types of ways that protest is thought of outside of the paradigm of the worker strike. This is kind of the central criticism that I've talked about in a lot of other series that I've done talking about the worker strike, in terms of the ways in which the articulation of a worker strike opens up the ability for the sovereign to crack down and break down on other types of movement making, and the way in which that kind of like structuring of like what the navigation of particular violence should be only allows the continued investment in like further recognition from the state, instead of an antagonistic relationship to the ways in which the state and private companies are able to like orient themselves in relationship to these communities and are able to produce various forms of like violence through the kind of like hoarding of resources, production of scarcity, like acceleration of climate change, etc., all of which are really pertinent to the ways in which this kind of like resolution is being thought of as well. I think that when you kind of like transition this into what are some of the main ways in which this is used on the affirmative and negative, I feel like on the affirmative there are definitely a bunch of arguments to be made about like why why arguments about like indeterminacy and the way in which there should be kind of like the refusal of the question of the resolution could be really interesting, because of the resolution is already limiting the frames in which we can talk about the existence of colonialism and its like foundational relationship to like wage labor in the first place. And so I think there are so many good arguments to be made about why that gives uniqueness for this kind of like indeterminacy or refusal to basically answer the question of the resolution, and why that produces the same type of like responses to like what should be done on the outside. I also feel like it walks like this very like thin line between like not having to win that the state is bad in every case, but still being able to win that there shouldn't have to bear the responsibility of how forcing there's like a choice between like how the resolution should be oriented, because of the way in which it blocks out so many various forms of like agency and the way in which people are able to assert themselves as agents. I then think that when you're trying to transition into like what are some of the main ways this is used on the negative, obviously I think this is a really core negative strategy for both policy teams and affirmative teams. I definitely think that allows a lot of really interesting pivots into the types of ways that people will read advantages about things like climate change and about things like just the conditions of workers in general and things like disease, etc., and even the international kind of like scale impacts as well, all of which I think are really interesting arguments to be made about how all of those modelings kind of forget and are in the process of doing the erasing that the central resolution does by basing that kind of like progress on this kind of industrialization that is already taken for granted, because of the ways in which it basically erases the history of colonialism's like central kind of like role in the production of such a production of scarcity and such a resource hoard. And so I feel like a lot of the ways that alternatives can go are both on the end of refusal, but also winning arguments about why various types of movement making outside the state, various types of resistance that happen, and kind of like protection practices that happen are those that kind of like are necessary, like not just rituals, but also like acts of resistance that are able to kind of like fight back against the way in which the sovereign is able to continue attempt to capture various forms of resistance via its continued erasure of like genocide, this structuring paradigm for the existence of like such forms of like extreme like impacts and things in the first place. I think that this works really well against when teams are reading like really like existential impacts about things like war and extinction, etc., because of the way that those impacts are kind of created, all of which are able to like basically lean themselves into like a lot of like settler futurism arguments that are based in like why the particular attachment to like being able to assert life in the future and depending that on this kind of like universalized subject such as the worker is the exact process of being able to like assume there is this like way to hold hands and walk into the future without the active recognition and understanding of like how settler colonialism continues to like bear and haunt the way in which we are able to like live ethically in the present and in the future. Hopefully this video is helpful as an introduction. Hopefully it will at least give some framing to some of the other videos I'll be doing talking about settler colonialism on the workers' strike top resolution. And yeah, thanks as always.